Ships today survive Arctic ice, cross oceans at record speeds, and even rely on renewable systems to cut fuel costs. But at the Cape of Good Hope, technology still collides with limits geography refuses to move. Insurance and war risk surcharges, combined with the real chance of severe storm damage, make it one of the most expensive alternative routes. And under normal conditions, choosing the Suez Canal instead saves about 3,700 miles of sailing. We'll show the mix of weather, geopolitics, and economics that keeps most ships away. Sailors once explained these dangers through legends. The ghost of the Flying Dutchman still haunts 2025. The ghost of the Flying Dutchman still lingers in 2025, not as a specter on the horizon, but as a reminder of how treacherous the Cape of Good Hope continues to be. For sailors centuries ago, this story of a cursed captain condemned to sail forever was less about fantasy and more about survival. It gave shape to the dangers they faced when ships vanished without explanation in sudden storms, and it personified the sense of doom that clung to the southern tip of Africa. The myth endured because, in the absence of forecasts and instruments, sailors needed a narrative to make sense of seas that seemed determined to swallow them whole. Today, there's no need for superstition to explain what makes the Cape so brutal. The Southern Ocean here lies within the Roaring Forties, where prevailing winds howl through latitudes unbroken by large landmasses. At the same time, currents from the Atlantic and Indian Oceans converge, creating unpredictable swells and violent cross seas. This unique geography acts like a natural machine for generating storms. Meteorologists can predict when pressure systems will intensify, but even with modern tools, ships in these waters still encounter conditions that push the limits of engineering and seamanship alike. Satellite and ship data show waves in the region can exceed about 14 meters, or roughly 46 feet, during extreme conditions. To put that into perspective, that's taller than a 4-story building coming at a vessel broadside in a moving wall of water. Wind bursts layer on more chaos, with short intervals separating gusts strong enough to overwhelm steering and strain engines. For crews running tight schedules, these conditions often force decisions between slowing to a crawl, stretching voyages by several days, or risking significant damage to vessel and cargo. The data makes clear why the Cape still functions as a choke point of risk. Telemetry from recent years consistently reports weather-related delays, even as ships rely on voyage planning algorithms and real-time satellite feeds. Unlike calmer routes, where strategic detours often avoid the worst of a storm, no amount of routing fully sidesteps Cape weather. The combination of shifting systems and mixing currents means captains must either endure severe seas head-on or loiter offshore, waiting for conditions to relent. Either option slices into efficiency and profitability, while exposing ships and crews to danger that cannot be engineered away. Rogue waves offer one of the starkest examples. These rare but devastating walls of water rise unpredictably, and the Cape ranks among the global hotspots where they are most often recorded. Container stacks have been smashed or swept overboard by their force, producing losses measured in millions. To the officers on watch, it is a moment that feels almost indistinguishable from the legends, a sudden, overwhelming reminder of nature's indifference in the same waters that inspired centuries of ghost stories. This is what explains why the Flying Dutchman still haunts conversations, even if only as a half-joking reference. The story distilled what mariners knew deep down, that these waters guarantee hardship. Today, science replaces curse with data, but the outcome is the same. The Cape of Good Hope sits on the edge of predictability. Technology helps, but the Cape shows where technology meets nature's limits. That recognition filters into the strategies of shipping companies in 2025. Conference presentations detail atmospheric models, routing simulations, and risk scenarios, yet the recommendation echoes the warnings of the past. Avoid rounding Africa unless no other choice exists. The myth may be folklore, but the realities that inspired it remain constant, with little sign of easing. And it is that continuity of risk that shapes decisions about global shipping lanes. Faced with one route where storms, damage, and costly delays are nearly assured, and another where traffic jams and crises erupt only occasionally, the choice most companies make is easy. One passage remains feared, the other indispensable. Suez Canal, the shortcut that keeps the Cape empty. The Suez Canal represents the central artery of modern shipping. In 2025, it still carries between 50 and 60 vessels each day across its 120-mile span, funneling roughly 10 to 12% of the world's trade, everything from oil and manufactured goods to grain and raw materials. That efficiency is what allows Europe, Asia routes to avoid an extra 3,700 miles around Africa. For global operators balancing costs, schedules, and carbon restrictions, the canal is irreplaceable. Those savings translate into something greater than convenience. Each passage trims fuel requirements, lowers crew costs, and helps fleets meet emissions regulations that longer voyages through the Cape would inevitably breach. Anchoring strategies around Suez allows companies to move vast amounts of cargo while keeping routes lean and competitive. It's no exaggeration to say that without Suez, modern just-in-time supply chains would falter under pressure. But dependence carries its own fragility. In 2021, when the container giant Ever Given ran aground diagonally inside the channel and remained stuck for nearly a week, world trade shuddered to a halt. A single obstruction left billions in cargo idling at sea, disrupted supply chains across multiple continents, and required extensive salvage work before vessels could move again. The incident underlined how even one miscalculation in such a narrow corridor can ricochet through the global economy. And yet the response to that disruption highlighted a contrasting reality. Once the canal reopened, traffic returned almost immediately to prior levels. After insurance adjustments and short-lived cost spikes, operators continued to prefer Suez. The preference is simple to explain. A blockade at Suez happens rarely and ends within days, but taking the Cape adds thousands of miles and weeks of sailing every time. Businesses would rather occasionally grapple with stoppages than guarantee delays on every voyage. The numbers from 2025 show this calculus in action. Shipping manifests confirm that Egypt remains the most instructed waypoint for fleet managers crafting long-haul schedules. Investments back this up. Dredging projects expanded draft clearance for larger vessels, while digital traffic systems were introduced to reduce collision hazards. Though the canal's narrowness ensures that risks remain, companies weigh probability. A costly incident every few years is still easier to accept than the certainty of higher expenses on every passage past Africa. Economics offer another layer of clarity. Rounding the Cape burns thousands of additional tons of fuel for large container ships compared to a voyage through Suez. With carbon pricing fully integrated into many national regulations by 2025, operators know that every extra mile multiplies financial penalties. Across entire fleets, the difference is measured not just in billions of dollars annually, but in lost competitiveness for firms unable to keep pace with more efficient rivals. A single canal keeps those penalties at bay. There is also the labor dimension. Crew rotation schedules and safety standards hinge on predictable voyage durations. Longer journeys increase fatigue risk, put pressure on mandatory rest cycles, and complicate labor negotiations with unions. A canal that reduces time at sea is not solely about profit margins. It also helps ensure ships arrive safely with rested crews. Extending voyages by 2 weeks undercuts both safety margins and contract compliance. Political stability enters the equation as well. Egypt's government remains under strong international pressure to safeguard operations, meaning patrols and reinforcements keep disruptions relatively rare. Meanwhile, the Cape offers neither protection nor predictability, only the inevitability of storms and route inefficiency. From a commercial standpoint, one corridor, though vulnerable, is actively maintained, while the other is dictated by raw geography and weather systems that no intervention can tame. The lessons from past disruptions clarified these distinctions further. Executives studied the Ever Given's grounding not to abandon Suez, but to assess contingency frameworks. They refined port redirection policies, built regional buffer spaces in supply schedules, and invested in capacity elsewhere. At no point did they shift preference toward Africa as a standing route. The calculation remained steady: endure occasional, manageable gridlock at a choke point, or risk constant weather exposure and cost inflation south of Africa. One looks painful but finite, the other unavoidable and permanent. Traffic totals continue to prove that choice correct. Even after public focus on dramatic blockages, volumes through Suez hold firm. Fleet managers consistently mark it as the planned corridor, leaving the Cape as an option of last resort, an emergency path when all else fails, not a viable replacement. Predictability is the guiding principle. The canal can be disrupted, but it can also be repaired and restored on measurable timelines. The Cape offers nothing comparable, only a guarantee of longer, harsher voyages. The conclusion is straightforward. Shipping depends on Suez despite the vulnerabilities it periodically reveals. The difference lies in the type of risk. One corridor forces temporary pauses that can be cleared by engineering crews. The other imposes permanent disadvantages built into geography and climate. For shippers under extreme pressure to keep goods flowing, the decision is not difficult. Still, reliance on a single corridor also creates new forms of exposure. Problems at Suez are not always accidents or engineering mishaps. Political and military pressures can spill over into the waterways feeding into the canal, and when those pressures flare, the shipping industry has to rethink its options quickly. As recent years have shown, those surrounding waters are no less volatile than the seas at the tip of Africa. They simply pose a different kind of danger. Red Sea conflicts forcing detours. By late 2023 and into 2024, Houthi attacks in the Red Sea escalated sharply, forcing global shipping companies to reconsider routes they had relied on for decades. Armed with drones and long-range missiles, the group targeted vessels in transit between the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and the northern entrances of the Red Sea. Flames on the horizon and reports of ships struck mid-voyage made it clear that risks were no longer theoretical. Early industry data noted severe incidents, including 2 bulk carriers that sank in July 2025 and casualties among their crews. For captains accustomed to the routine of Suez, the sudden presence of weapon strikes marked a dramatic shift in the region's safety profile. The economic fallout arrived just as quickly. Insurance underwriters began adding steep surcharges for any vessel transiting through the danger zone. By mid-2024, war risk premiums for Red Sea voyages had risen into the 0.5 to 1% range of a ship's hull value, according to multiple maritime reports. That meant that on a large container vessel valued at hundreds of millions of dollars, companies faced millions in additional costs for just a single journey. Shipping lines that had already priced out futures months in advance found their calculations collapsing under the new fees. The unpredictability of the premiums was equally damaging. Rates shifted week to week, depending on fresh reports of missile launches or attacks, leaving accountants with no way to stabilize expenses. Faced with these financial shocks, many carriers began to divert their voyages away from the Red Sea entirely. Announcements from major container lines during 2024 and early 2025 confirmed what tracking data made visible. Ships were rerouting southward, taking the long passage around the Cape of Good Hope. On the surface, it looked like a rational, even cautious choice. Why risk a missile impact when another road existed? But from a commercial standpoint, it meant swapping a low probability, high-impact danger for guaranteed higher costs and harsher conditions. Storm systems, added mileage, extensive fuel burn, and rising emissions penalties all came with the southern detour. Calculus was difficult. Passage through the Red Sea carried the chance, still statistically limited, of catastrophic damage, loss of life, and global headlines. Rounding Africa removed that possibility but replaced it with nearly certain overages in cost, weeks of delay, and the erosion of freight competitiveness. On balance sheets, managers weighed reputational risk against financial certainty. While a missile strike was rare, the reputational weight of a vessel disabled or sunk was nearly incalculable. Detours, meanwhile, inflicted slow but dependable losses borne voyage after voyage, month after month. Shipping's divide in response reflected the size of the players involved. Large multinational carriers could absorb the extra insurance fees or distribute detour costs across hundreds of routes. Smaller operators, on the other hand, struggled. Many lacked sufficient leverage to demand better terms from insurers and could not easily raise freight rates to cover extended operations. For some, contracts were withdrawn by charterers judged too risky, leaving vessels idle. Others attempted the Cape only to find the costs far greater than their reserves could sustain. The burden skewed toward the weakest firms, while the largest consolidated contracts, amplifying the financial imbalance across the logistics industry. There were visible knock-on effects at ports as well. With many tankers unwilling to cross the Red Sea, refueling and resupply demand shifted rapidly. Ship-to-ship bunkering expanded in alternate hubs such as Mauritius, Mumbai, and Sohar, while official reports tracked a steep decline in petroleum and crude cargoes moving through Suez. Maps of shipping density illustrated the trend. Lanes thickened around southern Africa, while Red Sea traffic thinned, punctuated by naval patrols and occasional escorted convoys. The strategic consequence was unmistakable. One of the world's biggest arteries had lost its dependability, and the burden of global transit shifted thousands of nautical miles away. Efforts to stabilize the Red Sea brought limited relief. Governments organized naval escorts for some high-value convoys, while private firms offered onboard security. These measures lowered risks but could not erase them. The Red Sea covers thousands of square miles, and protective fleets could not be everywhere at once. Missiles launched from inland still threatened ships, even when patrols were nearby. By contrast, attempts to optimize the southern route through weather modeling or deploying new wind assist sails lessened inefficiencies but never eliminated the fundamental cost of adding nearly 3,700 miles to each voyage. Neither path delivered true security or stability. The dual stress spread to crews as well. Seafarers assigned through the Red Sea described heightened anxiety, knowing attacks gave little warning and defense options were limited. Those diverted south endured longer journeys through relentless waves, with more fatigue and delayed port calls taxing their stamina. Companies attempted to introduce additional rotations to prevent exhaustion, but global shortages of trained personnel meant crews still worked longer stretches. The psychological strain reflected a broader truth of maritime trade. Choices made in boardrooms often passed directly to the individuals at sea, who shouldered the brunt of the danger. By the close of 2025, clear patterns had formed. Traffic swerved back into the Red Sea when stretches of calm prevailed, only to flow southward again after renewed attacks. Right-sizing costs meant toggling between insurance surcharges in one corridor and fuel bills in the other. For shipping executives, the year became a constant balancing act that undermined any sense of reliable planning. Global trade resembled a pendulum, swinging sharply between two options, with no secure equilibrium point in sight. This left the Cape of Good Hope cast in a role it has played repeatedly throughout history, not the route of choice, but the reluctant backup when doors elsewhere close. Each diversion underscored its reputation as a road of last resort, unavoidable in emergencies, but carrying heavy costs of its own. Storms, fuel strain, and emissions fees built into every transit exacted a toll as real as any war risk surcharge. The world's fleets could sidestep missiles in the north only by enduring the ocean's punishment in the south. And while violence explained why so many ships turned away from the Red Sea, it only partly accounted for why companies hesitate to commit to the Cape as an alternative. Even when the skies above the Red Sea quiet, the challenge of sailing under Africa remains constant and painfully clear. Distance and time still make the Cape costly. Rounding Africa typically adds about 10 to 14 extra days and roughly 3,700 additional miles to an Asia-Europe voyage. That single statistic shows why the Cape is not just dangerous but costly. Even under calm skies, the added distance shifts every calculation a shipping line must make. The oceans might test a ship with heavy weather, but the arithmetic of time and fuel weighs just as heavily on the decision to avoid the southern route. A large container vessel departing from Shanghai for Rotterdam illustrates the problem. Through the Suez Canal, the trip already requires close to 2 weeks of continuous sailing. Add the Cape, and the voyage stretches nearly another 2 full weeks. That expansion multiplies operating costs across every line item. Modern vessels burn thousands of tons of bunker fuel, even with efficient engines. On longer routes, the cumulative consumption rises dramatically. Industry reporting during 2024 noted that diversions from the Red Sea pushed global demand for bunker fuel up by as much as 200,000 barrels per day, underscoring just how costly the detour is. Fuel is only one part of the ledger. Longer passages also mean crews remain at sea well beyond planned contract schedules. International labor rules mandate rest hours and require rotation after specified limits, so ship owners must either pay extended wages or bring in replacement teams. Emissions reporting creates another layer of penalty. The extra miles translate into thousands of additional tons of carbon, and by 2025, many markets impose charges or require companies to purchase offsets for those excess emissions. The cost structure is therefore threefold and unavoidable: more burning of fuel, more pay for labor, and higher emissions penalties. Together, they form the decisive arithmetic that makes the Cape unattractive even before weather factors are added. Attempts to soften the blow through new technology can only do so much. Trials of wind assist sails, oversized kites, and hybrid propulsion systems have produced fuel savings in the 5 to 10% range. That margin matters in controlled tests, but the Cape's penalty is measured in thousands of miles and weeks of lost time. No experimental retrofit replaces what distance takes away. At best, these innovations cushion the financial hit. They cannot remove the fundamental disadvantage of a longer route. The effects ripple outward beyond individual voyages. Each extra day at sea reshuffles schedules for inland transportation waiting on containers. Trucks, trains, and warehouses rely on predictable arrivals. Delays at sea quickly cascade into late deliveries on land, contract penalties, and shortages for retailers. On a global scale, these disruptions spread into manufacturing and consumer markets, undermining entire supply chains. A ship tied up for 28 days instead of 18 doesn't just cost more in direct expenses, it interrupts the rhythm on which trade depends. Opportunity costs magnify the pressure. When a vessel spends 2 extra weeks completing one assignment, it cannot be used for another. Shipping companies may respond by chartering or purchasing additional vessels to meet demand, but those options are financially significant. A new container vessel costs hundreds of millions, and charter rates remained high in 2024 and 2025. Each detour around Africa effectively shrinks global capacity by reducing the number of trips a finite fleet can complete in a year. That diminished flexibility is particularly damaging when demand shifts unpredictably. The Cape also highlights a difference between predictable and unpredictable risks. Storms are uncertain, but they don't strike every ship. Insurance offers protection against those losses, and voyages may pass without mishap. Distance, however, imposes a guaranteed cost every single time. Operators know that diverting a fleet south means accepting higher fuel bills, slower schedules, inflated labor costs, and heavier emissions tallies. With Suez, rare blockages or conflicts may cause disruption for days or weeks, but most of the time the shortcut pays off. At the Cape, the losses are reliable and permanent. Companies consistently choose to avoid a route where the penalty is built in. Some observers argue that evolving technology will eventually level the playing field. Automation might reduce crew costs, advanced engines could extend efficiency, and alternative fuels may mitigate carbon penalties. But these shifts cannot change the geography. A shorter path remains shorter, and a longer one remains longer. Every real-world test during the mid-2020 confirms the same lesson. The Cape's additional distance cancels any advantage from improved design. Faster computing or cleaner fuel cannot erase 2 weeks of sailing. For consumers, these calculations do not remain abstract. The extra costs of detours filter directly into the price of goods. Electronics, textiles, food products, and industrial components all depend on timely shipping. When voyages take longer and cost more, distribution slows and shelf prices rise. Even far from the ocean, the Cape's arithmetic reaches consumers in supermarkets and hardware stores. Its burden is measured not just in fuel bills, but in higher prices paid by households worldwide. The common assumption that storms alone make Africa's southern passage unappealing misses this deeper economic truth. Meteorological risks are serious, but distance and time are immovable. Ships may be built stronger, forecasts may grow sharper, and sails may capture renewable energy, but nothing reduces the voyage by 3,700 miles. That fact defines balance sheets more than any weather system. The Cape empties accounts as steadily as it batters hulls. And yet, distance and time are not the only invisible weights carried by vessels that attempt the long way around. Even before cargo leaves port, costs begin to accumulate from another source, not from the length of the journey, but from the premiums companies must pay to insure it. Insurance premiums, the invisible barrier. For shipowners, insurance premiums form the hidden weight of rounding Africa's southern edge. Long before a vessel endures waves or storms, insurers attach costs to the voyage because of how they rate the Cape's risks. Underwriters consider it a near-perfect nexus of danger: heavy weather, structural strain, container loss, and residual piracy concerns. Each element feeds into calculations that determine how much must be paid simply to enter those waters. By 2025, those premiums had risen high enough that many operators hesitated to send ships around South Africa even when the Red Sea was under threat. Marine insurers build their models on probabilities of loss. For Suez passages, those probabilities usually involve machinery breakdowns in crowded lanes, collisions in confined waters, or political flare-ups. At the Cape, the risks shift overwhelmingly to natural forces: swells battering hulls, cargo slipping overboard, steering compromised under violent cross seas. Records of stress fractures, rescue operations, and storm damage confirm that the loss ratios south of Africa remain stubbornly higher. The Gulf of Aden or Mediterranean may be volatile at times, but they offer predictability. The Cape is instead priced as inherently unstable. This difference also explains why insurers categorize policies differently. A voyage through the Red Sea usually draws a specific war risk premium, reflecting exposure to missiles or armed groups. A voyage around the Cape triggers higher weather and hull risk charges, since the danger lies in violent seas rather than hostile fire. For operators outside the industry, the distinction might seem trivial, but in practice, it divides how surcharges are structured and how severe they become. By 2025, adjustments by underwriters imposed steep hikes for southbound detours. Reports indicated that premiums for ships rounding Africa often ran 30 to 40% higher than for comparable voyages via canals. To put the difference another way, while war risk surcharges in the Red Sea had been pushed into the 0.5 to 1% range of hull value after renewed Houthi attacks, weather-based premiums along the Cape made overall costs equally punishing. The justification was simple: storms cannot be avoided or negotiated away, making them a permanent charge on any vessel daring that stretch. Real-world financial consequences are enormous. A container ship valued at $150 million, carrying cargo worth many times that, might face insurance fees rising by several $100,000 for a single Cape passage. For operators with tight margins, that additional outlay can erase profitability before the keel even crosses open water. Even modern vessels equipped with reinforced hulls, updated lashing systems, and younger crews only receive modest discounts. The baseline premium makes every Cape voyage a calculated financial loss. Evidence supports why insurers take this position. The World Shipping Council reported that the number of containers lost at sea rose from 355 to 576 in its 2025 figures, with a noticeable share of those incidents tied to rerouted traffic in South African waters. These increases were not theoretical; they represented measurable exposure that underwriters immediately accounted for. Cargo falling into the ocean is not just reputational damage or paperwork. It informs actuarial tables that shape the cost structures pressing down on the entire industry. Piracy remains a secondary risk factored into Cape pricing. Although not as acute as during the Somali crisis a decade earlier, the Gulf of Guinea saw a resurgence of assaults into the mid-2020s. Insurers argue that ships diverting south pass through waters still rated as vulnerable to hijack. Even if actual attacks near the Cape are rare, The geographic proximity to unstable coastlines ensures the fee remains. In practice, this turns a detour meant to avoid missile zones in the Red Sea into a different package of risk, repackaged as weather and opportunistic piracy costs. These financial mechanisms scale with devastating speed. A single voyage may lose profitability outright, but scaled across entire fleets, the drain grows striking. A large carrier managing several hundred vessels could watch annual balance sheets swing by billions if too many ships are forced south. This is why executives often bet on short-term Suez disruptions instead. A temporary blockage or regional crisis can pass within days or weeks, allowing premiums to stabilize. Cape pricing, by contrast, does not return to baseline. It reflects a geography that cannot be altered, translating exposure into permanent expenses. Recovery infrastructure, or the absence of it, adds to the calculus. In the Mediterranean or northern Red Sea, tugs, ports, and salvage services are densely distributed. A damaged vessel can be assisted quickly, minimizing cost and risk to cargo. At Africa's southern edge, support is sparse. A single distressed ship may require long delays before rescue, inflating recovery bills into millions. Insurers account for this in advance, raising premiums even before a ship sails. From their perspective, the Cape's remoteness ensures that accidents are not only more likely, but also more expensive to resolve. Seasonality magnifies the burden further. Between May and September, historically stormier months in the southern Atlantic, underwriters harden their terms. Premiums climb as insurers factor in heightened likelihood of container washouts and structural harm. For companies able to adjust schedules, there is an incentive to avoid those months. For those bound by strict delivery contracts, however, the only option is to pay. The Cape thus ties costs not only to geography, but also to the calendar, locking shipping into cycles of seasonal expense. Insurers defend these practices with considerable evidence. Claim records consistently show Cape passages contribute disproportionately to container loss, hull stress, and delays, even when compared to other long-haul routes. The numbers anchor premium structures in hard data rather than speculation. For operators, that distinction may matter little. Whether justified or not, the costs function like a tax applied to geography itself. No lobbying or innovation can reset actuarial history. Naval architects and operators have tried to argue their way into lower rates. Investments in wave monitoring systems, reinforced lashings, and specialized routing firms demonstrate good practice. Some underwriters do reward such measures, but the scale of discounts remains modest. Technologies cannot erase the unpredictability of rogue waves or the inevitability of multi-week stress loads on hulls. Insurers, therefore, continue to treat every vessel as carrying elevated exposure, even if it sails with cutting-edge equipment. When companies compare invoices, the imbalance stands out. A Suez passage may draw heavy war risk fees during flare-ups, but sees those rates subside once political crises pause. A Cape passage, however, never resets. The baseline premium is fixed to geography and waves. For decision-makers, this imbalance explains why fleets often idle and wait for northern waters to calm rather than divert south immediately. Waiting out danger is frequently cheaper than absorbing guaranteed Cape surcharges. The effect is cumulative. The more voyages detour south, the more evidence accumulates of damaged hulls, lost cargo, or delayed rescues, and the more resolute insurers become in maintaining high rates. Operators bear costs from both sides, paying more in premiums and absorbing reputational harm when incidents confirm the underlying risk tables. This creates a reinforcing loop where danger inflates premiums, premiums discourage traffic, and reduced traffic concentrates further risk on the ships that dare the passage. In broad perspective, the Cape has become less a maritime problem than a financial one. It is not only the pounding surf that dissuades operators, but the invisible markups written in underwriting offices thousands of miles away. Insurers do not sink vessels, but they can make voyages uneconomical before they even begin. That hidden, intangible layer levies a cost just as severe as any storm at sea. It is why captains and accountants alike recoil at the choice, recognizing that expense shadows them from the first chart plotted. And while these premiums already weigh heavily, what lies ahead threatens to magnify them further. Weather itself is shifting, with storm systems growing stronger and less predictable along Africa's southern oceans. For underwriters, this means higher odds of claims. For ship owners, even steeper fees. The environment that produced today's premiums is not standing still. It is entering a phase where the barriers may rise higher than ever. When climate change makes the Cape worse. In the mid-2020, another force began reshaping conditions at the Cape, a force far larger than insurance markets or individual storms. Climate change has started to alter the patterns that crews and planners once relied upon. Researchers studying southern Africa's oceans point to a consistent trend. Warmer sea surface temperatures and shifting wind currents are fueling stronger, less predictable weather in the waters where the Atlantic and Indian Oceans meet. It is here, at this geographic collision zone, that even modest shifts in climate manifest as major hazards for shipping. Oceanographers have long described how warmer seas hold more energy. Higher temperatures allow the ocean to retain more moisture, setting the stage for heavier rainfall and stronger storm systems. The World Meteorological Organization has warned that these factors also intensify storm surges, especially when combined with global sea level rise. At the Cape of Good Hope, these changes combine with local geography. The powerful Agulha's current flowing from the Indian Ocean collides with colder Atlantic flows, and when warmer waters fuel that interaction, the outcome can be violent waves and erratic winds. This is less about abstract climate models and more about on-the-ground impacts observed by mariners and supported by regional data. Ship reports illustrate the change clearly. Mariners in 2025 describe encountering waves exceeding 14 meters in height more frequently than in prior decades. While monster waves have always been a feature of the Cape, records suggest their average heights and intensity are increasing. What once appeared as rare, one-off rogue waves now emerge in longer, more punishing clusters. The challenge for crews is not riding out a single crest, but absorbing wave after wave at ship-breaking scale. Storm cycles, once confined largely to May through September, now seem to arrive outside traditional seasonal windows. Tracking data confirms that unusual surges have spiked in months previously viewed as relatively safe. Attribution studies lend weight to these experiences without overstating certainty. World Weather Attribution and similar groups have highlighted that warmer oceans in the South Indian Ocean basin have increased the intensity of extreme rainfall and storm events across parts of southern Africa. Though they note variability remains and some uncertainties are high, the data points to a future with greater risk in regions like the Cape, where competing currents already prime conditions for volatility. Climate scientists explain that even small increases in ocean heat expand the likelihood of severe outcomes, and the Cape is precisely where those amplified dynamics hit ships head-on. The physics translate into everyday costs for operators. A higher mean sea level increases the base upon which waves build, making storm surges stronger and more destructive against ship hulls. Engineers reinforce container lashings, yet 2025 industry reporting documented stacks collapsing under pressure that existing standards should have survived. The damage does not always sink ships, but bent fittings, twisted decks, or partial cargo loss translate into insurance claims, repair delays, and lost contracts. In an industry predicated on tight turnaround times, these disruptions ripple through entire supply chains. The notion that global warming might create new maritime opportunities, such as an ice-free Arctic opening to trade, does not apply here. For southern Africa, the inverse is true. Warming seas intensify hazard rather than relieve it. Ships venturing through the Cape struggle with amplified wave energy, unpredictable storm tracks, and a blurring of seasonal distinctions. This reality undermines older arguments that Africa's southern passage could serve as a reliable alternative should other routes falter. Instead, the Cape grows less predictable every year, reinforcing its reputation as the world's least dependable detour. Crew testimonies confirm the human scale of these changes. Logs from diverted voyages in 2025 note near misses where severe shifts tossed containers into the ocean despite reinforced bindings. Masters recount losing satellite connections in violent squalls, forcing reliance on outdated backup instruments as conditions worsened within hours. Anchoring for shelter is little help, since sudden surges can drive ships toward hazardous coastlines, narrowing already thin margins for safety. Technology provides forecasts, but sailors report that warnings often arrive too late or underestimate the speed of deterioration. For those on deck, storms shaped by warming seas are less a statistical model than a lived threat. For operators, climate uncertainty forces hard trade-offs. Continue using the Cape, and a company must accept higher insurance rates, greater odds of equipment damage, and mounting repair costs. Avoid it, and fleets are funneled through limited passages such as Suez, where geopolitical instability creates its own risks. The fundamental challenge is that climate change multiplies vulnerability across every corridor. Nowhere is that more evident than at the Cape, where traders already contended with high winds and hostile seas long before today's climate shifts deepened the dangers. What once was a seasonal hazard is now a year-round operating problem. Records from decades past identified May through September as the peak hazard window, but in 2025, serious storms increasingly struck in historically calmer months. This complicates the calendars both insurers and fleet managers rely on. Premiums once varied by season, but if violent seas strike in October or February as often as in July, then predictable models collapse. Operators no longer plan only for seasonal surges. They prepare for disruption at any time of year. That erosion of predictability removes the small flexibility companies once used to balance costs and scheduling. The global shipping map reflects these imbalances. Northern passages such as the Arctic attract fresh interest as summer ice retreats, offering shorter voyages during fair seasons. Yet at the same time, the Cape declines further as an option precisely because warming intensifies its existing hazards. The asymmetry illustrates the uneven nature of climate change. New doors may open in one hemisphere, while others close more firmly elsewhere. For the Cape of Good Hope, warming is not opportunity, it is a magnifier of risk. Some responses on the technical side aim to counter the problem. Naval architects refine hulls with resilient steels, fit ships with larger stabilizers, and integrate sensors designed to detect structural stress in real time. These innovations do improve survival odds and reduce the scale of some damages, but they can only manage consequences, not prevent causes. They cannot halt the formation of stronger swells or redirect shifting pressure systems. Climate change operates on a scale larger than what individual ships or even entire fleets can engineer around. Company executives acknowledge as much, noting that technology buys time but rarely restores profitability in waters as volatile as these. Analysts sometimes propose that the Cape could still serve as an emergency corridor, one to use only when shorter routes become impassable. Yet climate models projecting further ocean warming warn that conditions will worsen, not ease, in coming decades. Forecasts expect not only higher maximum wave heights, but also more unpredictable storm tracks and stronger surges fueled by rising seas. This ensures that any fallback role the Cape occupies will be even costlier and more perilous than it already is today. Maritime safety assessments from 2025 frame the region less as an emergency option than as a last resort threshold that companies enter reluctantly, knowing the risks to profit and life are significant. Seen from this perspective, descriptions of waves rising above 4 stories are less sensational than they might sound. They capture a repeating trend, not an exception. Climate factors already amplify the same geographic collision that has defined the Cape since sailing records began. Centuries ago, legends like the Flying Dutchman put a face to its mystery. Now, climate data underlines the same point in more clinical but equally ominous detail. This corner of the ocean resists predictability. That resistance shapes not only folklore, but also 21st century logistics and insurance. The key issue is that climate change compounds, rather than relieves, the Cape's long-standing dangers. Every uptick in ocean heat injects more volatility into storm cycles, raising the barriers for ships already struggling with cost, distance, and unpredictability. Neither reinforced designs nor advanced monitoring systems erase those fundamentals. The Cape of Good Hope remains a proving ground for human endurance, made harsher by the accumulated shifts of a warming planet. And the critical question now turns to the measures shipping companies place their faith in. If the seas themselves grow harsher, can new materials, AI-driven weather models, and reinforced hulls truly tip the balance for fleets attempting the passage? Or do even the newest ships face limits in waters shaped by forces far greater than engineering can solve? High-tech ships versus unforgiving seas. The latest generation of cargo vessels arrives equipped with technology that would have been unthinkable a few decades ago. Control systems now synthesize live feeds from satellites, display storm projections in real time, and even suggest course adjustments before a front builds on the horizon. Hulls are forged from advanced steel alloys designed to flex under stress instead of fracturing. Stabilizer's moderate role in bad weather, and AI-driven routing software runs quietly in the background, pulling data from ocean buoys and orbital sensors alike. On paper, these ships should handle nearly anything the oceans present. Yet in the waters south of Africa, those expectations keep colliding with a brutal reality: storms and seas that overwhelm even the best hardware. Technology thrives where patterns can be recognized. Automated docking reduces accidents in predictable port settings, and navigation software cuts costs across calm, steady routes by trimming fuel consumption. But the Cape does not operate in patterns. Instead, two massive ocean systems, the cold Benguela current from the Atlantic and the warm Agulhas from the Indian Ocean, clash unpredictably. Pressure systems shift quickly, winds drive swells from multiple angles, and cross seas form in minutes. Predictive models improve awareness of this instability, but cannot forecast exactly when or where a sudden sea state change will occur. For captains, the result is not clear instructions for evasion, but bundles of warnings advising that danger is likely everywhere. Compressed into real voyages, the failure of predictability becomes obvious. A container ship south of Cape Town in 2024, fitted with modern stabilizers and reinforced lashings, still lost stacks of containers during a rogue wave sequence. The systems did not malfunction. They absorbed and responded, but the wave patterns came from too many directions at once, producing forces outside their design tolerances. Offshore engineers later pointed to parametric rolling, a destabilizing condition triggered when successive swells match a ship's natural frequency of motion, as the culprit. No computer model predicted it at the critical moment. For insurers tallying the damage, the presence of advanced technology mattered little. The losses still ran into the millions. Broader evidence matches these single stories. The World Shipping Council recorded a jump in container losses during 2024-25, especially among vessels pushed onto longer southern routes by Red Sea conflicts. Operators pointed out that most of these ships sailed with state-of-the-art cargo securing systems, yet the Cape's conditions regularly overran those protections. A hull reinforced for the North Atlantic might withstand severe swells for days without issue, but repeated stress events under Africa accumulate in ways the models do not yet predict well. By the time an exhausted crew steers into calmer seas, cracks may already be running below the waterline. This gap between design and reality makes the Cape uniquely resistant to technological progress. Whether routing algorithms prove their worth elsewhere, a tanker in the Pacific can shave days from a voyage by steering clear of a cyclone projected 3 to 4 days in advance. At the Cape, models generate dense clusters of uncertainty markers covering hundreds of nautical miles, effectively telling crews that hardship cannot be avoided. What technology creates, then, is awareness, not escape routes. Automated dashboards light up with alerts and probability scores, but they rarely transform into actions that prevent ships from being caught in the thick of a storm. Crew testimonies from these voyages reflect the frustration. Officers describe bridges filled with precise data that confirm conditions are worsening, yet offer no feasible path out. Warning after warning mirrors what their senses already detect: winds rising, seas chopping from multiple sides, containers groaning against lashings. Far from reassuring, the flood of inputs can exacerbate stress. Sailors remark that 21st-century dashboards make them more conscious, of just how far outside safe margins they are drifting without providing practical remedies. Instead of reducing tension, the illusion of control amplifies anxiety while the ship continues to pitch and roll. To be clear, these high-tech systems do achieve results in reducing the most catastrophic outcomes. Fewer ships sink outright, and casualties are lower compared to past centuries when wooden hulls faced the same waters. Autonomous monitoring has saved crews by giving them precious minutes to secure decks before major surges. Reinforced alloys bend instead of splintering, meaning vessels limp back to port instead of vanishing beneath the waves. But profitability relies on more than survival. A ship that survives with fractured plates, collapsed container stacks, and weeks lost in the repair yard leaves charterers just as unsatisfied as one that never arrived. Safety gains ease human risk, but they do not erase the financial imbalance. Industry analysts note how this difference shapes strategic choices. Operators cannot overlook advanced safety systems because they perform well across most oceans. However, when plotting long-haul routes between Asia and Europe, those same executives acknowledge technology does little to justify detouring south. The passage demands extra time, guarantees extra fuel burn, and still carries higher odds of damage. Autonomous routing and predictive weather software are now industry standard, but they do not change the fundamental equation. Cape voyages remain more expensive and more uncertain. Practical comparisons hammer this point home. In calmer seas, improved stabilizers and optimized hull geometries turn into measurable gains. Insurance fees dip, damages decline, and voyages accelerate. At the Cape, identical designs still produce reports of cracked welds and cargo toppled into the ocean. Every published case confirms a simple theme: tools that excel in stable systems function poorly in volatile ones. Engineers can reinforce hulls and equip sophisticated monitoring, but no amount of tuning removes the shocks produced when competing waves converge in chaotic bursts. Accident records reinforce the unease. Casualty totals are lower than in earlier centuries, but incident rates at the Cape still exceed those on nearly all other established global routes. When damage claims are tallied, regional routing consistently carries a larger share. The advances that once promised conquest of the world's oceans now reveal their boundaries. Technology closes gaps almost everywhere else, but here it finds its sharpest limit. From the perspective of shipowners, this knowledge feels like a paradox. They spend millions on upgrades and digital systems, watch safety metrics improve globally, and then confront a single corridor where the return on those investments collapses. Operators describe the Cape as a natural test site where reality strips away illusions. Naval architects can show improved stress tests in laboratories. Software vendors can market clever forecasts. But when gale-driven seas throw parametric rolls across a 400-meter container ship, the limits of design and prediction come into stark relief. For the maritime economy, the outcome is predictable. The Cape remains an emergency detour, a corridor embraced only when other doors are slammed shut. Progress has shrunk dangers worldwide, but here it merely prepares ships to endure, not thrive. Awareness has become the prize, not avoidance. And as insurers price voyages accordingly, companies still weigh the route as a cost trap rather than a competitive choice. Technology has blunted some of the Cape's sharpest edges, but left its essence intact. Volatility that refuses to be smoothed into models. From rogue waves to rolling stress, forces continue to outpace the reach of algorithms and alloys. And while these hazards dominate discussions of weather and engineering, the seas south of Africa conceal another factor shaped not by storms, but by human threat, a risk that lingers alongside nature and complicates every decision about whether to pass that way. Piracy still casts a shadow. Piracy in 2025 remains an unrelenting factor in route planning, even if it no longer dominates front-page headlines. While missiles in the Red Sea or surging storms at the Cape draw more global attention, the threat of armed boarding still shapes decisions in boardrooms and on bridge decks. Operators must calculate not only the costs of distance and weather, but the possibility of armed men in skiffs attempting to climb their hulls. The persistence of this problem highlights a reality that has changed little in decades. While cutting-edge technology defends against storms, human threats remain stubbornly difficult to eradicate. After nearly a decade of relative calm, Somali piracy showed signs of resurgence in 2023 and 2024. International naval patrols that once blunted the threat scaled back as funding and priorities shifted elsewhere. Small groups reorganized, reviving the same tactics that once terrorized merchant shipping. Reports documented renewed attacks against slower bulk carriers and tankers straying even modest distances off convoy routes. Assaults often began with volleys of small arms fire, sometimes backed by rocket-propelled grenades intended to intimidate crews into surrendering. In one widely reported incident, Somali pirates hijacked a commercial vessel hundreds of nautical miles from shore in 2024, successfully holding it until ransom was paid. Though far fewer than the wave of seizures in the early 2010s, these attacks shook confidence by showing the reach and resilience of organized groups. Meanwhile, in the Gulf of Guinea, piracy persisted in a different form. Rather than extended hijackings, raiders there focused on rapid kidnappings of crews for ransom. Even with increased naval coordination, incidents in 2024 confirmed the region's status as a hotspot, accounting for a significant portion of global crew abductions. Industry figures from prior years put the Gulf of Guinea at up to 43% of all worldwide piracy incidents, and the renewed pace kept insurers wary. For vessels rounding Africa from east to west, bypassing these waters is almost impossible. Tankers and container lines diverting to the south often must pass near Nigeria or its neighbors, where the threat of sudden boarding hangs fresh. The distinction between the two regions is critical for understanding maritime security. Somali piracy tends to involve long-range hijackings, where vessels are seized and then held offshore for ransom negotiations. In contrast, Gulf of Guinea piracy is shorter and sharper, centered on seizing crew members and departing before naval reinforcements arrive. Both profiles complicate shipping, but in different ways. The Somali model ties up ships and cargo, while the West African version destabilizes crew management and safety agreements. Together, the two zones bookend Africa with overlapping risks. This geographic layering produces an uncomfortable paradox. A fleet that diverts around Africa to avoid missile strikes in the Red Sea may discover that it has steered directly into areas where piracy risks are higher. Crews escape one form of violence only to face another. Charts display storms brewing ahead, but plotting alternate paths often drags ships closer to coasts notorious for raider activity. Instead of relief, detours extend the map of insecurity, turning Africa's waters into a continuum where political and criminal threats intersect. For insurers and operators, piracy translates immediately into numbers. War risk surcharges spike in the Red Sea, but piracy risk premiums increase the moment a vessel passes within range of Somali or West African coasts. These layers are added to storm premiums already imposed around the Cape. One voyage south now requires 3 parallel sets of insurance charges: weather exposure, structural stress, and piracy threats. The cumulative effect often outweighs the original cost of waiting out a temporary crisis in the north. This is why many vessels idle longer than planned, holding back at anchor until one corridor clears enough to offer a predictable, if still costly, passage. Crews experience these challenges most directly. Mariners in 2025 report heightened anxiety during southern routes, particularly when passing through waters flagged for recent hijackings. The strain of maintaining extended watches in seas already battered by storms weighs down morale. Defensive measures, razor wire spiraled along rails, spotlights mounted at the stern, or water cannons fixed to decks, remain standard. But these precautions do little to reassure those on board when rough seas make decks near impassable, just as surveillance must increase. Against swells hammering broadside, maneuvering away from fast skiffs is not always possible. Sailors endure not one threat, but a convergence of mechanical, natural, and human hazards. Shipping firms have turned to private security teams for partial relief. Armed guards aboard vessels discourage most Somali-style seizures, yet they involve costs and legal complications. Certain ports prohibit vessels carrying weapons, requiring disarmament and bureaucratic delays before arrivals. Rotating contracts create logistical headaches, while the expenses of security stack atop already bloated detour bills. For firms already wrestling with higher insurance and slower delivery schedules, layering in armed escorts proves a burden only the largest carriers can easily absorb. The persistence of piracy is rooted in conditions that enforcement rarely corrects for long. Weak governance, coastal poverty, and desperation create fertile ground for raiders. Both East and West Africa feature unstable zones where state patrols are thin and maritime law enforcement has limited reach. Piracy resurfaces whenever international focus drifts elsewhere. This cycle, lulls followed by resurgence, reminds the industry that small, lightly equipped groups can still disrupt global commerce. Cargoes worth billions depend on narrow margins of safety, and piracy provides unpredictable shocks to those logistics. For planners, piracy fuses uncomfortably with the Cape's natural risks. Routing software already estimates costs for storms and insurance-linked hull strain. Adding the possibility of boarding attacks near Somalia or Nigeria complicates every calculation. Where storms make the Cape expensive, piracy makes it unpredictable. The resulting combination undermines the idea that detouring south is a clear solution. Even when natural forces are reluctantly accepted, the human element adds another cost stream that operators can neither design nor insure away without penalty. The strategic consequence is stark. Piracy multiplies existing burdens at the Cape rather than substituting for them. Storm premiums, insurance surcharges, and fuel costs are already daunting. The possibility of raiders approaching across open seas means those numbers climb higher, feeding directly into freight rates and delivery times. For many companies, it turns the backup path into a trap of overlapping expenses and insecurities. This is why piracy, though less visible in headlines, still plays an outsized role in discouraging traffic from Africa's southern edge. Crews and executives alike learn the same lesson. The dangers once thought of as relics of the early 2000s remain potent. Somali hijackings demonstrate that determined groups regain capacity once international vigilance drops. Gulf of Guinea incidents prove that desperation combined with weak enforcement fuels repeat risk. In boardrooms, this knowledge shapes policy. In wheelhouses, it shapes routine stress. Both confirm that choosing the Cape comes with consequences far beyond storms. When combined with climate volatility, distance overheads, and escalating insurance costs, piracy ensures that Africa's southern detour rarely looks like a rational choice. It converts an already punishing passage into one shadowed by the possibility of human conflict at every stage. The shadow is not constant hijackings or headlines, but the structural reality that any voyage must budget for it in advance. That persistent shadow is enough to steer global trade away. This recognition reinforces why the Cape remains avoided in 2025, despite its apparent availability as a backup. Costs grow steeper the longer risks layer onto one another, and piracy ensures that no rerouting plan escapes unscarred. As global carriers assess their options, the conclusion repeats. Vulnerability spreads across Africa's waters, while efficiency and security lie elsewhere. The question that follows naturally is what other paths remain for world trade, and whether alternatives beyond Africa's southern seas can finally provide the stability the industry seeks. Rising alternatives to the Cape. By mid-decade, global carriers were no longer asking whether they could tolerate the Cape's costs. They were asking where else their ships could go. In 2025, that question began shaping investments, corridors, and technology in ways that steadily erased South Africa's southern passage from serious planning. It was not simply about choosing between Cape storms or Canal chokepoints anymore. The industry was moving toward alternatives that promised lower exposure to both, and those options, though imperfect, were starting to take shape. One of the most watched developments came from the far north. The Northern Sea route, once considered impractical because of permanent Arctic ice, has become increasingly navigable in summer. Climate change that destabilizes weather in the south has also lengthened the ice-free season in the north. Records show usage of this corridor has grown, with annual traffic distances in the Arctic doubling between 2013 and 2023. By 2025, shipping companies routinely complete voyages during summer months without icebreaker assistance, trimming weeks off journeys between Asia and Europe. The route is not risk-free. Ships face ice flows, narrow channels, and harsh cold, but the savings in distance and transit times make it a viable counterpart to Suez. Arithmetic reflects why operators invest here. The Northern Passage reduces thousands of miles compared with a Cape detour and bypasses risks from the Middle East altogether. For firms balancing carbon regulations with competitiveness, this matters. Emissions are lower, costs shrink, and schedules tighten. The premiums charged in the Arctic remain high, but they are priced around seasonal hazards instead of the perpetual storm risk south of Africa. On balance sheets, that difference is significant. Infrastructure along northern coasts now adapts to this shift. Russian Arctic ports, Scandinavian terminals, and satellite-linked rescue stations have expanded to support summer traffic. At the same time, fuel hubs in Mauritius, Mumbai, and even Soha report stronger bunkering activity whenever vessels are forced away from Red Sea lanes. These signals confirm that the system around global shipping is beginning to adjust in anticipation of alternative corridors growing in importance. Unlike the desolate Cape, these avenues offer supporting infrastructure where ships can divert, refuel, or seek help when needed. Still, operators keep Arctic dependence in perspective. Navigation there remains highly seasonal, typically stable for 3 to 4 months of the year, and requires reinforced hulls or ice-class certification for longer deployments. Political complications make the equation even harder. Sovereignty disputes along Russia's northern coast complicate permissions, while sanctions restrict collaboration with Russian authorities. Executives describe Arctic voyages as viable but selective. They help reduce pressure on other routes, but cannot replace them outright. The point, however, is that the industry is actively financing this corridor, while investment into the Cape stands still. Beyond geography, technology has opened another type of alternative. Carriers are experimenting with renewable assist ships designed to operate fuel-efficient routes across calmer oceans. These vessels employ sail systems, rigid wings, or solar-boosted hybrids that offset fuel costs and cut emissions. Though they cannot reach the speed of canal corridors, they make longer mid-Atlantic or Pacific runs practical when cargo owners emphasize carbon compliance. For global fleets under rising regulation, such as the European Union's FuelEU Maritime Framework, which mandates major reductions in emissions intensity, these passage choices gain weight. Carbon credits and reduced penalties often offset slower transit times. Reports from trials confirm measurable results. Auxiliary sails and wing systems routinely reduce fuel consumption by 5 to 10%. When scaled to large fleets, this translates to millions saved annually alongside reputational gains with regulators and investors. Importantly, these technological paths give carriers freedom to select open ocean tracks that avoid Cape turbulence. The storm-lashed southern tip is poorly suited to using renewable wind power, but steadier mid-ocean latitudes make consistent gains feasible. Governments and financial institutions reinforce this trend. Subsidies back pilot projects for renewable assist fleets, while trade blocs offer tax incentives for cleaner voyages. Flag states and classification societies tighten their emissions reporting standards, making it harder for fuel-heavy detours to compete financially. Each incremental regulation nudges investment toward alternative paths, and those funds materialize in ship design, new port facilities, and even research consortia that link engineers with shipping firms. In this environment, the Cape looks increasingly like an outdated liability, unchanging risks weighed against dynamic opportunities appearing elsewhere. Executives are already redistributing their fleets to strengthen resilience. They split voyages. Some run through the Suez Canal when conditions permit, others switch north for summer Arctic windows, and a growing share sail experimental renewable assisted passages across calmer latitudes. This diversification ensures no single choke point or blockade threatens entire supply chains. Analysts note that Africa's southern waters rarely figure into these strategies except as an emergency fallback. Even when Red Sea volatility peaks, operators prefer detours supported by hubs and incentives rather than falling back on the storms and premiums of the Cape. Traffic numbers affirm what strategy makes clear. In past eras, Africa's southern tip served as a secondary thoroughfare when northern waters closed off. Today, diversion numbers show the opposite. Ships increasingly bypass the Cape altogether, refining schedules around corridors that balance carbon compliance, resilience, and lower long-term costs. Investment patterns follow, whereas port expansions and bunkering upgrades flow toward Arctic staging points or Indian Ocean way stations. South Africa receives little attention. The absence signals a shift. The Cape is no longer treated as a viable alternative worth developing. That does not make new routes immune to problems. Arctic passages depend tightly on seasonal climate trends, and shifts in geopolitical tension can pressure northern access. Renewable assist vessels still struggle with speed and scaling limitations, but each alternative demonstrates progress and attracts resources. Every year brings efficiency gains, new financing structures, and deeper regulatory incentives. In contrast, the Cape's risks remain static, offering no improvement trajectory. Operators see advancement everywhere else and stagnation south of Africa. From a broader perspective, this rearrangement reshapes how maritime trade conceives geography. The iron rule that fleets must pass through fixed points is fading. Climate change closes some doors and opens others, while technology expands operational ranges. Regulatory frameworks and insurance pricing accelerate momentum in certain directions while starving others of investment. On the new map of 2025, lanes through the Arctic or across renewable-friendly oceans are highlighted. The Cape of Good Hope, once central to global trade, has shifted to the margins of planning. This shift underscores a final point. The Cape is not just neglected because of storms or higher costs. It is steadily abandoned because resources, innovation, and infrastructure are concentrating elsewhere. Where planners once argued how best to endure South Africa's seas, they now sidestep the argument entirely by choosing different paths. Northward through ice-free corridors or westward across carbon-efficient mid-oceans, modern fleets are constructing futures that deliberately leave the Cape behind. But while global planners and engineers look forward to those alternatives, crews still reckon with the realities left behind. For mariners, the Cape does not vanish into maps. It remains a place of consequence whenever politics elsewhere force a detour. Its reputation, built across centuries, endures in other ways too. Long before financial surcharges or carbon penalties, it earned a far darker reputation from the trail of wrecks along its coast, and those physical scars still mark the southern passage today. Casualties and shipwreck trails. The southern tip of Africa has earned the title Graveyard of Ships, a name backed by records of nearly 3,000 wrecks along its coasts and surrounding waters. This staggering figure illustrates the harsh legacy of the Cape of Good Hope, where centuries of vessels, from wooden fleets to modern carriers, met the same fate against hidden reefs, unpredictable currents, and violent storms. The wrecks remain scattered on the seabed, serving as physical testimony to how geography and weather have long overpowered technology. Every ship lost carried its own story. Some ran aground on submerged rocks in poor visibility, while others fractured under towering swells driven by winter gales sweeping in from the Southern Ocean. Even as construction shifted from wood to iron and steel, and navigation systems grew more sophisticated, the Cape continued to claim victims. Accident reports from recent decades confirm this persistence. While absolute global casualties are far lower than in past centuries, Allianz Research in 2023 recorded overall ship losses at their lowest levels on record. The Cape still registers incidents at a higher ratio compared to its modest traffic volume. The fact that so few ships use the passage, yet accidents continue, underscores its disproportional risk. Modern data narrows this imbalance even further. Compared to major ocean lanes across the Pacific or North Atlantic, where vast volumes of cargo transit daily, the Cape sees a fraction of the vessels. Yet, when wrecks and losses are measured against that smaller numerator, the proportional hazard becomes clear. Traffic has declined precisely because of this history, yet casualty charts show the region resisting the downward trend visible in safer corridors. For insurers and planners alike, the message is undeniable. Volume adjusts downward, but per-ship exposure here remains stubbornly above average. The toll on human lives compounds the reputation. Although fewer vessels sail and fewer are lost globally, those that do falter at the Cape face slimmer margins of survival. Geography dictates the lag. Unlike the Mediterranean or northern trade hubs, the Cape offers only scattered ports and sparse support infrastructure. When a ship signals distress in heavy seas, rescue may take hours or even days, not minutes. Storms often prevent helicopters or smaller craft from launching. That delay is critical. A survivable accident in another region can escalate into fatalities here simply because assistance cannot arrive quickly. For crews, this reality sits uncomfortably in training programs, where the Cape is consistently cited as one of the regions where self-reliance is essential. Historical records and seasonal patterns define when the risks intensify most clearly. From May to September, the southern winter, conditions repeatedly turn destructive. Storm tracks surge across the Atlantic, winds accelerate, and seas build steep, breaking waves that strike even modern hulls with destabilizing force. Fleet planners treat these months as red-flagged periods. Routing software automatically elevates warnings, and many managers instruct ships to wait in safer anchorages rather than transit the Cape during peak winter volatility. The pattern holds with such consistency that global cargo flows ripple annually around it. But prediction has limits. Identifying dangerous months improves planning, yet storms evolve too quickly for precise avoidance. A weather system may escalate to extreme within a handful of hours. Even satellites feeding real-time data into algorithmic forecasts struggle to capture sudden rogue wave sequences or the resonance conditions that push large vessels into parametric rolling. Crews face the double burden of knowing when the risk statistics rise and recognizing that no forecast clears a path with certainty. Operating during winter becomes an exercise not in control, but in mitigation, with crews bracing for conditions they cannot fully avoid. These patterns force the industry to factor casualties into every decision about Cape transits. The numbers do not just sit in maritime archives, they enter directly into calculations of cost, safety practices, and liability. A single high-profile tragedy prompts not only public scrutiny, but also spikes in premiums and shareholder concern. With reputations and balance sheets tied to safety performance, executives cannot justify risking routes that continually record disproportionate hazards. The continuity of those losses across centuries proves too deeply rooted for companies to dismiss as chance. Yet despite widespread avoidance, incidents still occur. Recent reports from salvage firms confirm modern cargo damage and crew losses in Cape waters, even with limited traffic. Near-miss data, collisions narrowly averted, containers washed overboard, and hull fatigue requiring emergency port calls add to the record. Fewer ships passing, yet continuous problems points to a fault line carved into geography itself. Operators infer correctly that even advanced planning reduces exposure, but never eliminates it. Optimism at the Cape has always carried a price, one visible in statistics and survivor accounts alike. The physical remnants along the Cape's shoreline drive home this point with clarity. Divers still survey scattered anchors, hull fragments, and twisted machinery resting just offshore. Many wreck sites have been catalogued by maritime archaeologists, ranging from 17th century Dutch and Portuguese galleons to contemporary steel vessels broken against reefs. While the details differ, the collection as a whole illustrates continuity, the same waters absorbing generation after generation of shipping technology. Remnants of modern ships, still recognizable today, confirm that casualties are not distant history but living realities, updated yearly. For crews, the impact is more personal. Seafarers swap stories at ports about voyages caught in Cape weather, and training regimes highlight emergency protocols rooted in the geography's dangers. Unlike abstract charts, these narratives circulate quickly across companies and languages, warning new recruits of the hardships and validating the anxieties of veterans. Informal knowledge often proves as influential as official documentation. when multiple generations of sailors exchange cautionary tales tied directly to personal loss or near misses. Reputation embeds deeper than any safety brochure can dislodge. Rescue lag amplifies that shared fear. Mariners know that if their ship falters near Europe, Japan, or the Persian Gulf, assistance often arrives quickly. At the Cape, isolation slows the chain of help. Navigation officers have logged how distress calls stretching across rough seas sometimes yield only delayed aid. For families waiting at home, the gap between accident and report extends agonizingly longer than in more populated waters. Crew memories build around this delay, reinforcing the perception that Cape risks are not just statistical, they are deeply human. Attempts to reframe this coastline's identity as scenic or commercially useful have never offset the accumulated record. Investment campaigns promoting South Africa's ports as gateways to global highways collide consistently with charts of wreck densities and casualty tallies. Nearly 3,000 losses anchor memory in quantifiable history, while seasonal charting injects fresh evidence annually. The narrative is structural. Accidents embedded in water and weather, repeated across centuries, outlast marketing language. This legacy feeds directly into decision-making today. Freight planners balance efficiency, but statistics of wreck ratios tilt heavily toward avoidance. Insurers reinforce the calculus with higher premiums. Captains speak candidly of dreading southern assignments, recognizing what statistics already confirm. Academics and safety councils underline numbers showing accident density disproportionate to traffic. Together, these voices converge around the same conclusion. South of Africa, risks outweigh potential savings. The Cape's reputation in 2025 emerges not from folklore, but from durable evidence. Nearly 3,000 wrecks mark its past, while present ratios show persistent hazard despite overall global safety improvements. Rescue delays and harsh seas amplify human cost when accidents do occur. Memory, numbers, and lived experience align to define the region as an outlier of risk. What this reveals, above all, is that accidents there are more than statistics. They embody geography's enduring refusal to be engineered away. Storm cycles may ebb, fleets may modernize, but the cumulative trail of wrecks and casualties shows that inherent danger still governs this route. In operational terms, avoidance remains the only truly reliable safeguard. That is the reality confronting shipping companies in 2025. Technology and planning can narrow probabilities, but the geography of the Cape dictates limits that cannot be erased. And it is this recognition that natural boundaries continue to rule global trade routes that frames the final lesson of the Cape for modern shipping. In 2025, the Cape remains a route of last resort because the unavoidable triangle of geography, weather, and cost makes it uneconomical for routine use. As new corridors expand and technologies gain traction, its role is almost certain to stay marginal, overshadowed by routes that offer efficiency, predictability, and safety. Have you sailed near the Cape or followed the Red Sea crisis? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if you found this chapter of maritime history and modern trade useful, remember to like and subscribe for more deep dives.